Fame loves children because it doesn't have to keep them. One moment, they're everywhere. Cinema screens, living rooms, applause on cue. Then the credits roll, and the world moves on without them. Tonight, we're not revisiting scandals or comebacks. We're opening a forgotten door into vanished careers, silent exits, and lives that continued after the spotlight shut off. 17 British child stars, once unmistakable, now almost erased. This isn't nostalgia. It's what happens after the applause stops. Before we begin, take a second to settle in. If stories like this keep you up at night, subscribe to the channel. It's how these forgotten lives keep being told. And while you're here, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Some of these stories are best experienced in the quiet hours, when the past feels closest. 1. Matthew Garber. Matthew Garber's face is permanently frozen in one of the most carefully engineered fantasies of the 20th century, a neat London street, a prim family, a nanny who descends from the clouds with impeccable posture and impossible optimism. In Mary Poppins, 1964, Garber played Michael Banks, the wide-eyed child who learns, over the course of a few musical numbers, that adulthood doesn't have to be joyless, and authority figures might secretly be magical. He was 8 years old, and his performance was seen by millions across continents. For a brief moment, he wasn't just a child actor. He was a symbol of post-war innocence, carefully packaged and exported. Hollywood noticed. Audiences noticed. Studios noticed. But Matthew Garber did something quietly radical for a child star in the 1960s. He didn't stay. Unlike many young performers whose fame collapses under the weight of overexposure or industry cruelty, Garber's disappearance was subtler, almost polite. After Mary Poppins, he appeared in only a handful of additional roles. There was no scandal, no tabloid spiral, no dramatic public rejection of acting. He simply stepped away. School took precedence. Life narrowed back down to something resembling normal. While the world replayed his face endlessly on television screens, Garber moved forward in silence. This is where his story becomes unsettling. Not because of what happened on screen, but because of how abruptly it stopped mattering. Fame, at least the kind granted to children, is conditional. It exists only so long as the child remains useful to the fantasy. Garber aged. The fantasy didn't. So the industry looked elsewhere. In his late teens, Garber enrolled at university, reportedly studying science. No press releases followed him there. No former child star profiles. He wasn't trotted out for nostalgia panels or reunion specials. He became anonymous by choice and by circumstance, a former global icon blending into lecture halls and libraries. Then, just as quietly as he had exited fame, his life ended. In 1977, at the age of 21, Matthew Garber died from complications related to illness contracted while traveling. There was no long public mourning, no industry reckoning. The world didn't stop. The VHS tapes kept spinning. Michael Banks stayed 8 years old forever. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that contrast. The character lives on endlessly, singing about imagination and second chances, while the actor vanished before adulthood had a chance to fully begin. Garber didn't burn out. He didn't fall apart. He simply disappeared into reality, and reality did not offer a sequel. His story leaves behind an uneasy question that hangs over every child performer who follows. What happens when the role that defines you ends before you're old enough to understand it ever began? That question becomes even sharper when the next child star didn't just vanish quietly, but consciously walked away from one of the most famous roles British cinema ever produced. 2. Mark Lester. If Matthew Garber slipped out of fame like a ghost, Mark Lester stepped away with his eyes open. When Oliver. Premiered in 1968, Lester was 10 years old and suddenly everywhere. Billboards, cinema queues stretching down city blocks, award ceremonies. The film itself was a triumph, an Oscar-winning adaptation of Dickens that turned Victorian misery into a grand, singable spectacle. And at the center of it all was Leicester's Oliver Twist, polite, pale, and heartbreakingly earnest. He wasn't just famous, he was strategically famous. Oliver was sold internationally, and Leicester became one of the most recognizable British child actors of his generation almost overnight. Studio publicity painted him as the perfect boy next door. Interviews emphasized his manners, his schooling, his gratitude. The machinery worked exactly as intended. And then, unexpectedly, Leicester declined to let it keep working. Unlike many former child stars who later claim they were pushed out or forgotten, Leicester has consistently described his departure as deliberate. He continued acting into his teens, but the desire wasn't there. The adult roles felt wrong. The environment felt constricting. The future being offered to him, a lifetime chasing roles that tried to recapture a childhood image, held no appeal. So he chose a different path. Education first, privacy second, anonymity, eventually, as a form of luxury. In adulthood, Leicester trained as an osteopath and later as an acupuncturist. It's a detail that feels almost symbolic. The boy who once portrayed hunger and vulnerability for millions ended up working in a profession centered on healing and quiet, one-on-one human care. No red carpets, no auditions, no nostalgia tours unless he explicitly agreed to them. Of course, the public never entirely let him go. Rumors, retrospective documentaries, and speculative headlines periodically tried to pull him back into the spotlight. But Leicester's fame had an expiration date, and he honored it. He didn't vanish because the industry discarded him. He vanished because he refused to orbit his own childhood forever. That decision reframes the idea of disappearance itself. In a culture that treats continued visibility as success, choosing obscurity can look like failure unless you look closer. Leicester didn't lose fame, he returned it. And yet his story also exposes a quieter truth. For every child star who leaves on their own terms, dozens don't get the chance. They linger in casting offices. They wait by phones that stop ringing. They fade not because they chose peace, but because the industry quietly moved on. Which raises a more uncomfortable question. What happens when a child star doesn't consciously leave, but simply grows up in a system that no longer knows what to do with them? The answer lies not in cinema, but in British living rooms, flickering sitcoms, and a boy named Nicholas Bond-Owen. If you're still here, it means these stories are pulling you in. Consider subscribing. This channel is built for the ones who stay curious after the spotlight fades. And take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. These stories travel differently depending on the hour. 3. Nicholas Bond-Owen. Nicholas Bond-Owen didn't arrive in British culture with cinematic fanfare or orchestral swelling. He entered quietly, week after week, through the television sets of millions of households. From 1976 to 1979, he played Tristram Fourmile in George and Mildred, one of the most watched British sitcoms of its era. He wasn't the star of the show, but that was precisely the point. He was familiar, dependable, part of the furniture. Bond-Owen was 8 years old when he joined the series, and for several years, his face became inseparable from a specific rhythm of British domestic life. Laughter tracks, Sunday evenings, predictable comfort. In an age before streaming and constant choice, that kind of exposure mattered. Being recognizable wasn't a side effect of fame, it was the definition of it. And then the show ended. Unlike film child stars whose careers rise and fall dramatically, television actors often fade more slowly. After George and Mildred, Bond-Owen continued acting in smaller roles, but the momentum was gone. Casting shifted. He aged out of the cute bracket without aging into anything clearly defined. No one was waiting with a plan, so gradually he stopped. There was no official retirement announcement, no final curtain call. He pursued photography, studying the craft seriously, and building a career far from cameras pointed at his own face. Behind the lens suited him better than in front of it. It offered control, distance, and something the sitcom world never could: permanence without visibility. Bond-Owen's disappearance is instructive because it shows how easily fame can evaporate when it's built on familiarity rather than spectacle. He wasn't forgotten overnight. He was slowly absorbed back into normal life, one unbooked role at a time. Today, his name triggers recognition mostly among dedicated television historians and viewers who experience a delayed shock. Whatever happened to that kid? The answer, of course, is nothing dramatic. He grew up. The industry didn't grow with him. His story closes the door on one kind of vanishing: the quiet, almost bureaucratic fade-out of a child star whose fame was never designed to last. But the next disappearance is different, darker, more unsettling. Because some child stars weren't just familiar, they were unforgettable. And even that wasn't enough to save them from being left behind. 4. Martin Stevens. There are child actors who play innocence, and then there are child actors who unsettle you simply by standing still. Martin Stevens belonged firmly to the second category. By the age of 10, his face had already become synonymous with something deeply uncomfortable in British cinema: the idea that children are not always safe, sweet, or knowable. In Village of the Damned, 1960, Stevens played one of the eerily calm, white-haired children whose blank stares suggested intelligence without empathy. A year later, in The Innocents, 1961, he delivered another performance steeped in ambiguity and quiet menace. These weren't cheerful matinee roles. They were sophisticated adult nightmares filtered through a child's voice. Audiences noticed. Critics noticed. Stevens was widely regarded as unusually intelligent, articulate, and emotionally precise for his age. He wasn't just performing lines, he seemed to understand the psychological weight behind them. In another industry, at another time, this might have marked the beginning of a long, prestigious career. Instead, it marked the end. Stevens' acting career was deliberately halted while he was still young. Education was prioritized, not as a talking point for interviews, but as a firm boundary. Acting, especially roles of such psychological intensity, was deemed incompatible with a normal upbringing. And so, almost at the height of his visibility, he was removed from the screen. What makes his disappearance so striking is that it happened before the industry could fail him. There was no rejection, no decline in talent, no public disinterest. The door was closed while it was still wide open. Stevens went on to study architecture, eventually building a life far removed from British cinema. He relocated abroad, designing buildings instead of unsettling audiences. The boy once associated with humanity's darkest anxieties grew into a professional dedicated to structure, order, and permanence. It's a transition that feels almost poetic, moving from imaginary horrors to concrete realities. But his absence leaves a lingering unease. Stevens's performances still circulate, still disturb, still invite analysis. Film students dissect his line readings. Horror historians cite his work as foundational. And yet, the man himself remains largely invisible. There was no return tour, no nostalgic reinvention. The child stayed in the past, sealed inside celluloid. His story complicates the narrative of vanished child stars. Sometimes disappearance isn't a collapse, it's an intervention. A decision made early, before damage becomes visible. But it also raises a troubling question. When a child demonstrates extraordinary talent, who gets to decide whether that gift is used or buried? Because the next child star didn't disappear due to unsettling roles or deliberate removal. She vanished for a far more common reason. She simply grew up in an industry that had no interest in watching her do so. 5. Mandy Miller. Mandy Miller was one of the most recognizable child faces in British cinema at the start of the 1950s. When The Man in the White Suit was released in 1951, she was just 6 years old, sharing the screen with Alec Guinness in one of the era's most celebrated satirical films. Her presence was brief but memorable, a sharp-eyed child reacting to adult absurdity with unfiltered clarity. Audiences loved her because she felt authentic, not manufactured, not overly rehearsed, just present. In the tightly controlled studio system of post-war Britain, that kind of natural appeal was rare and valuable. Miller quickly became a familiar name, appearing in multiple films during the early part of the decade. She represented a very specific version of childhood, curious, articulate, and unthreatening. Exactly what British cinema wanted at the time, until it didn't. As Miller aged, the roles thinned. The industry that had embraced her as a charming child offered little space for her as an adolescent. She wasn't pushed dramatically out of the spotlight. She was edged out quietly by newer, younger faces. Typecasting did the rest. The qualities that made her successful at 6 became limitations by 12. Unlike later generations of child actors, there was no infrastructure for reinvention, no coaching pipeline, no rebranding phase. When the parts stopped coming, that was simply the end of the conversation. Miller transitioned into adult life without spectacle. She worked as a writer and journalist, crafting words instead of delivering lines. Her connection to fame became something historical rather than lived, a chapter she rarely revisited publicly. In interviews years later, there was no bitterness, only clarity. Acting had been something she did, not something she was. Her disappearance illustrates a particularly British form of erasure, polite, unemotional, and administratively final. No scandal was required, no personal crisis. The system simply moved on, and she moved with it. What lingers is the sense of how expendable child performers were in that era. Their success was temporary by design. When usefulness ended, so did visibility. And if Mandy Miller represents the quiet fading of a post-war child star, the next story shows something even more brutal. What happens when fame is manufactured aggressively, then destroyed by forces far beyond a child's control? 6. Binky Stewart. Binky Stewart didn't just become famous as a child. She was engineered to be famous. In the late 1930s, she was openly marketed as Britain's answer to Shirley Temple. The comparison wasn't subtle or symbolic. It was printed, promoted, and relentlessly repeated. At 5 years old, Stewart was positioned as a national treasure in miniature, appearing in a series of films designed to maximize charm, innocence, and mass appeal. For a brief moment, it worked. She was widely known, heavily promoted, and unmistakably visible in British popular culture. Her curls, smile, and musical performances were carefully framed to reassure audiences during a period of growing global unease. Then history intervened. The outbreak of World War II didn't just disrupt film schedules, it dismantled entire entertainment ecosystems. Studios closed, productions halted, priorities shifted from escapism to survival, and Binky Stewart's carefully constructed stardom collapsed almost overnight. Unlike modern child stars whose careers stalled due to market shifts, Stewart's disappearance was absolute. The industry she depended on simply ceased to function. By the time stability returned, she was no longer the age required for the role she had been cast to play. The moment had passed, and there was no second act waiting. She transitioned into ordinary adulthood, working in nursing and later office roles. The girl once positioned as a national icon faded into anonymity so complete that many assumed she had never existed beyond film reels and archival photographs. Her story is unsettling because it exposes how fragile child stardom truly is when it relies on forces no child can influence. Talent didn't save her. Popularity didn't save her. Even deliberate branding didn't save her. History simply moved faster than fame. Binky Stewart didn't fall from grace. Grace was removed from the world around her. And as we move forward, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. These disappearances aren't accidents. They're symptoms of war, of industry design, of cultural impatience. And the next vanished child star proves that even international exposure couldn't protect a young performer once the spotlight decided to look away. 7. Hazel Ascot. Hazel Ascot's fame belongs to a specific moment in British history, a narrow window when musical cinema offered lightness just before the world darkened. In the 1930s, Ascot was a genuine child star, not a novelty act or background presence, but a featured performer whose dancing feet and expressive face carried entire films. Talking Feet, 1937, showcased her as a confident, disciplined young performer at a time when British studios were eager to prove they could rival Hollywood's polish. She was 9 years old and already a professional. Audiences responded to her not because she was mischievous or precocious, but because she seemed composed beyond her years. There was a seriousness to her performances, precision, rhythm, control, that made her feel dependable in an industry still finding its footing. For a brief period, Hazel Ascot represented continuity, the idea that British cinema could cultivate its own stars, train them young, and keep them close to home. Then the war arrived, and the idea of continuity collapsed. World War II didn't just interrupt Ascot's career, it erased the environment that made it possible. Film production slowed to a crawl, resources were redirected, childhood itself was redefined by evacuation, rationing, and uncertainty. The elaborate machinery required to sustain a child star, dance training, studio scheduling, promotion, simply wasn't compatible with national emergency. By the time normalcy began to return, Ascot was no longer a child. And for the British film industry, that distinction mattered more than talent. Unlike later child stars, she wasn't expected to reinvent herself. There was no push to rebrand her as a teenage lead or dramatic actress. The assumption was silent but firm. Her moment had passed. So she stepped into a different life, becoming a school teacher, someone who guided children instead of performing as one. Occasionally, historians and film enthusiasts would track her down, decades later, treating her like a living artifact from a lost cinematic era. She would answer questions politely, with distance, as though describing someone else entirely. The films were real. The fame was real. But they belonged to a version of Britain that no longer existed. Hazel Ascot's disappearance feels almost too clean, too orderly. No scandal, no bitterness, just a career neatly folded away by circumstances larger than any individual. Her story reminds us that fame is not only fragile, it is historical. It depends on stability, infrastructure, and timing. Remove any one of those, and even a celebrated child star can vanish without resistance. And yet, even as war erased one kind of stardom, another kind was forming. One that would cross oceans, reshape identities, and prove that disappearing from the spotlight doesn't always mean leaving the industry behind. 8. Terry Kilburn. Terry Kilburn's career didn't end when he stopped acting. It simply changed direction. As a child in late 1930s British cinema, Kilburn was everywhere. He appeared in multiple high-profile films, most notably A Christmas Carol, 1938, where his performance reached audiences far beyond Britain's borders. He wasn't just visible, he was exportable, and that distinction would ultimately define his future. Kilburn's early success coincided with a rare opportunity, international mobility. As the war approached, he relocated to the United States, a move that saved his career from abrupt collapse, but also severed it from its origins. In Hollywood, he continued acting as a child and teenager, navigating a vastly different studio system with more resources, more competition, and less patience. Unlike many British child stars whose careers ended abruptly, Kilburn's faded gradually. As he aged, the roles became smaller, the novelty diminished, and eventually acting ceased to be central to his life. But unlike those who vanished entirely, Kilburn stayed close to the medium that made him famous. He moved behind the camera, becoming a television director and later an academic, teaching film and television studies in the United States. In other words, he didn't disappear from the industry. He disappeared from visibility. This kind of disappearance is subtle but significant. Kilburn traded recognition for influence. While audiences forgot his face, students learned under his guidance. While his name faded from marquees, it remained in credits, syllabi, and production notes. There's something quietly defiant about that choice. Child stardom often traps performers in a loop of nostalgia, forcing them to relive early success for diminishing returns. Kilburn stepped out of that loop entirely. He chose longevity over recognition. And yet, his story still carries a trace of loss. Ask casual viewers about A Christmas Carol and few remember the boy behind the performance. The image remains, but the person dissolves into background detail. Kilburn's disappearance complicates the idea of vanishing from fame. Sometimes it isn't failure or rejection, it's migration. A shift from center stage to infrastructure, from applause to authorship. But what happens when a child star doesn't migrate within the industry and doesn't cling to visibility at all? When they simply redirect their life somewhere else entirely? That question leads directly to the next disappearance. One shaped not by war or relocation, but by choice. 9. Desmond Tester. Desmond Tester belonged to an era of British cinema that has almost entirely slipped through public memory. In the mid-1930s, during the early years of sound film, he was a reliable juvenile lead, handsome, articulate, and versatile enough to anchor multiple productions. He wasn't a novelty or a gimmick. He was a working actor, appearing consistently at a time when the industry desperately needed dependable young performers. For several years, Tester's face was familiar to regular cinema-goers. He played earnest sons, adventurous youths, and romanticized versions of adolescence that fit neatly into Britain's cultural self-image. He was famous not because of one iconic role, but because of accumulation, film after film, performance after performance. And then he stopped. Unlike many child actors whose careers end because they're no longer wanted, Tester's transition was deliberate. As he approached adulthood, he stepped away from acting and redirected his skills toward production. Eventually, he moved to Australia where he worked as a television producer, helping to build programming rather than appear in it. In doing so, Tester completed a rare transformation, from visible talent to invisible architect. The audience that once recognized his face never followed him into this new phase. Why would they? Producers aren't meant to be known. Their success is measured in output, not applause. His disappearance is striking because it reveals how thin the line is between fame and anonymity. Tester didn't lose relevance. He lost recognition. The industry still needed him. The public simply didn't. Over time, his early acting career became a footnote, overshadowed by the rapid evolution of film itself. Sound cinema matured. Stars changed. Memories shortened. The boy who once carried films was quietly absorbed into the machinery that made new ones. Desmond Tester's story closes another chapter in the pattern of vanished child stars. Not erased by scandal, not destroyed by failure, just redirected by maturity, by opportunity, by a clear-eyed understanding that fame is temporary, but work can be enduring. And yet, as the decades roll forward, the disappearances don't become gentler. The next child stars won't be shaped by war or early cinema growing pains, but by television's relentless pace and the unforgiving speed at which it replaces its own past. 10. Pamela Franklin. Pamela Franklin's childhood fame wasn't loud, cheerful, or comforting. It was restrained, intelligent, and quietly devastating. When she appeared in The Innocents, 1961, she was just 11 years old, sharing the screen with Martin Stevens in a film that demanded subtlety rather than spectacle. This wasn't a role built on cuteness or novelty. It required emotional control, ambiguity, and an unsettling maturity that lingered long after the film ended. Critics were impressed. Audiences were unsettled. And Franklin was suddenly positioned as a serious young actress in an industry that rarely knew what to do with seriousness once childhood ended. Unlike many British child stars, Franklin didn't disappear immediately. She continued acting through her teens and into early adulthood, appearing in British and American productions. For a time, it seemed as though she might escape the familiar pattern, transitioning smoothly from gifted child performer to respected adult actress. But the transition stalled. As the years passed, the roles offered to her became narrower, less challenging, less visible. The industry that had praised her restraint as a child seemed uninterested in cultivating it in a woman. Opportunities diminished not because of scandal or failure, but because the system quietly lost interest. The kind of intelligence she brought to her performances no longer fit the templates being mass-produced. Eventually, Franklin stepped away. Hollywood didn't exile her. She simply stopped chasing it. Acting became something she had done rather than something she was still trying to prove. She chose privacy, and with it, near-total obscurity. What makes Franklin's disappearance unsettling is how easily prestige dissolves. A critically acclaimed child performance, even in a landmark film, offers no long-term protection. Talent does not compound interest. It expires unless constantly reinforced by visibility. Today, Franklin is rarely discussed outside of specialist film circles. Her name resurfaces mostly in retrospectives of The Innocents, as though her career were a single moment rather than a continuum. The industry remembers the child. The adult is optional. Her story exposes a cruel paradox. Being exceptional too early can trap an actor in an image they are never allowed to outgrow. And if a performer with her critical credibility could vanish so quietly, what chance did those whose fame came not from cinema prestige, but from relentless weekly television exposure? That question brings us directly into Britain's living rooms of the 1970s, and to a boy millions watched grow up before quietly forgetting his name. 11. Kevin Morton. Kevin Morton didn't become famous through a single defining performance. He became famous through repetition. From 1974 to 1977, he appeared regularly on Coronation Street, Britain's most watched soap opera, at an age when most teenagers are invisible to the broader culture. Morton wasn't a novelty guest or a one-off plot device. He was part of the fabric of the show, woven into storylines that millions followed week after week. That kind of exposure creates a peculiar form of fame. Viewers don't idolize you. They absorb you. Your face becomes familiar. Your voice becomes expected. And without ever buying a ticket or poster, the audience feels like they know you. For a teenager, that familiarity can be both powerful and limiting. When Morton left Coronation Street, the structure that sustained his visibility vanished instantly. Soap operas don't offer legacy careers. They offer momentum, and once that momentum stops, there's rarely a safety net underneath. Casting directors see the character before they see the actor. Audiences do the same. Roles became harder to find. Eventually, they stopped coming altogether. Unlike film actors whose absence can feel dramatic, a soap actor's disappearance is almost administrative. One week you're on screen. The next, you're not. Viewers adjust quickly. The show continues without pause. Morton returned to a private life in Yorkshire, far from the industry that had once made him a household presence. There were no reinvention attempts, no headline-grabbing exits. He simply stepped back into anonymity, carrying with him the strange knowledge that millions had once watched him, and then moved on. His disappearance highlights the unforgiving speed of television fame. It creates recognition without durability, attachment without loyalty. When the storyline ends, so does the attention. For audiences, it feels natural. For performers, it can feel like erasure. And if Kevin Morton represents the teenage actor quietly absorbed back into ordinary life, the next disappearance shows what happens when childhood fame is even more fleeting, designed not for mass audiences, but for a generation still figuring out who it was meant to serve. 12. Jack Wilde. Jack Wilde arrived like a spark thrown into dry straw. One moment, British cinema was doing its usual polite, buttoned-up thing, and the next there was this sharp-elbowed grin darting across the screen in Oliver, all confidence, mischief, and a voice that sounded like it had been born knowing how to steal a scene. At 16, Wilde wasn't just acting the Artful Dodger. He was the Artful Dodger. Audiences didn't see performance. They saw inevitability. Of course this kid would be famous. Of course this face would last forever. Hollywood agreed. Awards nodded. Television followed. H.R. Pufnstoof turned him into something even more dangerous than a respected actor. A brand. The kind that sells lunchboxes, jingles, and childhood itself. Fame didn't creep up on Jack Wilde. It tackled him at full speed and pinned him to the ground while everyone applauded. And then, nothing behaved the way it was supposed to. The problem with being unforgettable at 16 is that the world doesn't really want to remember you at 36. Wilde's voice, once his calling card, became a liability as tastes changed and novelty wore thin. Roles narrowed. Offers slowed. The industry that had lifted him up with both hands quietly stepped back, pretending it had never promised anything. When the work dried up, something else rushed in to fill the silence. Not drama, not scandal, just erosion. Health problems. Dependencies that began as coping mechanisms and ended as routines. The slow mathematics of a life shrinking. By the time his singing voice was gone for good, removed not by critics but by illness, Jack Wilde had already been written out of the story most people remembered. Not erased, just filed away as that kid from that movie. He lived out his later years far from the spotlight that once felt as natural as breathing. When he died in 2006, the tributes were warm, respectful, and brief. The kind that suggest affection without responsibility. The industry mourned him the way one mourns a photograph found in a drawer. Fondly, distantly, and without guilt. Jack Wilde's disappearance wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a lesson in how loudly applause can fade when it decides you've already given everything worth taking. And if that feels cruel, wait, because the next boy from Oliver took one look at that future and chose a completely different escape route. 13. Andrew Burt. Andrew Burt occupies an unusual position in the story of vanished child stars because, on paper, he never fully disappeared. His name still appears in credits. His face still turns up in reruns and archived television. And yet, the version of him that once mattered, the promising juvenile actor positioned as a future staple of British drama, quietly evaporated. In the early 1970s, Burt was a familiar presence in BBC television productions. He played serious, grounded young characters at a time when British drama prized restraint over spectacle. These were not flashy roles. They were credibility roles. The kind that suggested longevity. Casting directors trusted him. Audiences accepted him without question. For a while it seemed inevitable that he would glide into adult stardom. But inevitability is one of the great myths of the entertainment industry. As Burt aged, the transition stalled. The industry didn't reject him outright. It simply reclassified him from promising young lead to useful supporting presence. From someone whose name might sell a production to someone whose face filled space convincingly. He continued acting, but the cultural weight shifted. The spotlight moved elsewhere. This kind of disappearance is particularly difficult to process because it lacks a clear ending. There's no final role to point to, no dramatic exit. Burt's career thinned rather than snapped. One credit at a time, prominence dissolved. What makes this more unsettling is that talent was never the issue. Burt remained capable, professional, and reliable. But British television, especially in the decades that followed, increasingly favored either highly recognizable stars or entirely fresh faces. The middle ground, the space where experienced former child actors might rebuild, became narrow and unstable. So Burt continued working, but without the recognition that once framed his presence as significant. To the public, he vanished. To the industry, he became background. His story exposes a flaw in how we measure disappearance. Fame isn't only about whether someone works, it's about whether anyone notices. Burt didn't fail. He was filtered out, and that filtering process is ruthless in its quietness. No one announces it. No one apologizes. It just happens, while the performer keeps showing up, hoping the momentum might return. Andrew Burt represents the child star who technically survives the transition, but loses the narrative. And without a narrative, fame collapses into trivia. As we move forward, that collapse becomes more visible. Because the next child star didn't fade slowly into supporting roles, he vanished suddenly after carrying an entire series on his shoulders. 14. John Whiteley. John Whiteley's talent arrived early and landed hard. The kidnappers showcased him as emotionally intelligent beyond his years, and critics responded accordingly. This wasn't a case of a charming child holding together a simple story. Whiteley carried complexity. His performances suggested depth that promised longevity, the kind casting directors like to imagine stretching across decades. For a while, it looked inevitable. More films followed. Praise continued. He was positioned as someone who could grow with the industry. Then he didn't. Unlike many of his peers, Whiteley chose education over escalation. At a point when momentum might have locked him into the machinery of fame, he stepped off deliberately. School came first, then university. Acting became something he had done, not something he was obligated to continue proving. He didn't frame the decision as a rejection of cinema. He simply didn't prioritize it. And that quiet confidence, choosing long-term stability over short-term applause, effectively erased him from public consciousness. Whiteley went on to become a school teacher and later a university lecturer. The irony is almost too neat. A former child star dedicating his life to classrooms instead of screens. The skills transferred, the spotlight didn't. By the time his films were rediscovered by later generations, the person at their center had already lived an entire second life, largely unobserved. His disappearance feels almost polite. No bitterness, no nostalgia circuit. Just a clean break that left audiences with unfinished expectations. And while Whiteley opted for intention and structure, the next child star on this list would experience something far less controlled, a slow drift away from relevance that no amount of early acclaim could prevent. 15. Sally Boyden. Sally Boyden's childhood acting career unfolded quietly, spread across British television and film in the late 1970s. She was a working child performer, the kind casting directors relied on rather than celebrated. No single role defined her. Instead, she accumulated appearances, dramas, guest roles, small but consistent parts that signaled dependability rather than stardom. And that distinction mattered. Boyden's fame was subtle. She wasn't a headline name, but she was known within the industry and recognizable to attentive viewers. For a time, acting was simply what she did. Not a brand, not an identity. A job. As she grew older, that job lost its momentum. Opportunities became sporadic. The familiar pattern emerged. Fewer calls, longer gaps, less certainty. But unlike many former child actors who linger in that uncertainty, Boyden made a decisive shift. She left. Rather than chasing diminishing roles, she redirected her focus toward music and voice work, eventually moving abroad. In doing so, she removed herself not only from British television, but from British cultural memory. Geography completed what the industry had already begun. Her disappearance is notable because it wasn't driven by rejection or crisis. It was driven by recalibration. Acting no longer offered what she wanted from adulthood, and she refused to orbit a childhood identity out of obligation. In another context, this might be framed as success. A clean transition, a self-directed life. But within the mythology of child stardom, it registers as vanishing, because visibility is treated as the only valid outcome. Boyden's story reminds us that disappearance is often mislabeled. Sometimes it's not loss, it's escape. And yet, escape doesn't erase the pattern. One by one, these child stars step out of frame, leaving behind fragments of performances that outlive their relevance. Some choose it. Some are pushed. Some simply age out of usefulness. And as we approach the final entries on this list, the disappearances take on a heavier tone, because not every exit was orderly, and not every vanishing allowed for reinvention. 16. Hayley Mills. Hayley Mills didn't just become famous as a child, she became the reference point. When British audiences thought of a gifted young actress in the late 1950s and early 1960s, they thought of her. Tiger Bay announced her as something serious, something unusually composed, and Disney quickly transformed that seriousness into global reach. She wasn't niche. She was everywhere. Films, interviews, magazine covers, international distribution. Childhood fame doesn't get much bigger than that. And yet, that scale turned out to be part of the trap. Mills continued acting as she grew older, which is precisely why her disappearance feels so strange. She didn't vanish in the literal sense. She worked steadily, respectably, consistently. But the cultural intensity evaporated. The myth of Hayley Mills, the child phenomenon, refused to evolve, and every adult role she took was measured against a version of herself that no longer existed. The industry had already decided who she was. Audiences had already archived her. That's the paradox of extreme early success. Survival becomes invisible. If you don't collapse, you're assumed to have faded. If you don't scandalize, you're quietly dismissed. Mills' adult career was thoughtful and varied, but it unfolded in a media environment that had moved on to new obsessions. She became an actor rather than an event, and for former child stars, that downgrade can feel like erasure. Public memory flattened her into a nostalgic shorthand, while the actual person kept working, aging, adapting. Her story challenges the idea that disappearance requires absence. Sometimes it only requires comparison. When the peak is too high, everything afterward looks like decline, even when it isn't. And as Mills' fame slowly recalibrated into something quieter, another gifted child actor made a more decisive choice: to walk away completely before the comparison could even begin. 17. Simon Gipps-Kent. Simon Gipps-Kent sits at the very edge of childhood stardom, a reminder that disappearance doesn't always happen cleanly or quietly. He began acting young, appearing in British television during the 1960s, and grew up within the industry's orbit. By the time he appeared in Quadrophenia in 1979, he was no longer a child, but his identity was still shaped by roles that began in youth. For audiences, he was recognizable, not famous in the traditional sense, but familiar. The kind of face that signaled authenticity. He belonged to a generation of performers who transitioned awkwardly between eras, too old to be marketed as children, too young to be protected from adult expectations. Unlike many others on this list, Gipps-Kent didn't leave the industry early. He lingered. He tried to stay relevant, but the British film world of the late 1970s and early 1980s was changing rapidly, and there was little patience for actors without clear commercial value. Opportunities narrowed. Visibility declined, and without the support structures that might have existed decades later, marginalization became a personal experience rather than an abstract career shift. The industry didn't formally reject him, it simply stopped offering a place. Gipps-Kent died in 1986 at the age of 28. By then, his early work was already being overshadowed by newer faces and louder narratives. His passing barely registered beyond close circles and dedicated film historians. What makes his story resonate is not just the ending, but the trajectory. He represents the child actor who never fully escapes the gravity of early exposure, yet never finds a stable adult foothold either. Too visible to be anonymous, too forgotten to be supported. Simon Gipps-Kent's disappearance closes this list on an unsettling note. Across 5 decades, these child stars didn't vanish because they lacked talent or effort. They vanished because fame is conditional, temporary, and often indifferent to the people it consumes. Their performances remain, looped endlessly in reruns, archives, and memories. But the children themselves were never meant to stay. And perhaps that is the most unresolved mystery of all. Not why they disappeared, but why we ever expected them to remain.